Hi everyone, welcome. I've got my African night crawlers over here. They're now 91 days of age. And 91 days ago, when we moved the worms into this container here, into their new home, we held on to the material that had made up their old environment, the castings, and we treated it as a cocoon nursery like we do sometimes with my finished castings. So instead of going straight to the garden with the stuff, we held on to the stuff assuming that it had cocoons in it. Cocoons that needed a little bit of time to hatch, a little time for the babies to become big enough to get rounded up. And it was also pretty damp, so we needed some time for that material to get a little bit more crumbly and dry. And then at some point soon, I guess we're going to have to make the decision to start migrating worms out of that material too. At some point soon, I don't know if that could be today. I have been coming in here a few times regularly to try to break this material up, try to aerate it. So I haven't reserved activity on the cocoon nursery to my videos only. I have checked in here a few times off camera. So I'm going to get these systems up onto the bench and we're going to see where things stand. As far as the worms, I think they're due for a feeding after 11 days. So let's get to work. We're beginning in here in the cocoon nursery. In here I've been coming down to the wormery once in a while, just checking in on this material, trying to get it tilled up to aid in the drying. And the one thing I noticed when I bought this thing over from over there was how this thing still has flying insects in it. To me, flying insects is usually a telltale of excess moisture, and even though this thing's been sitting here uncovered for quite some time, there still must be way too much moisture in here. And I usually attest the clumping of the material like this to excess moisture, and you wouldn't say that this clump right here is exceedingly damp just to handle it, but at some point I believe it was, which caused it to fuse together. And perhaps only by at some point sinking it down low and getting it amongst some more damp materials might this stuff rehydrate to the point where it might soften up enough to break apart. But every one of these clumps, I believe, has some sort of like a little residual piece of bedding or food in it, and there was a lot of it. So funny thing about this system is that it almost seems like as these little clumps all start to dry out and break apart, they reveal more leftover food, more leftover bedding. It's almost like a self-sustaining system in a way. As it dries out, it yields more stuff that the worms can continue to use. And obviously, that need for drying means there's probably plenty of moisture in here already for the worms. So the reason I leveled things back off here, because I did want to see if I could use some of this material that I've been using to combat the flying insects in my systems. So even though adding a spritz of water down to a system where the aim is to see things dry seems a bit counterintuitive, in the long run I think it's worth its weight in gold. This stuff seems to have been doing a really good job in all my systems, but any place where there's still flying insects, I'm still breaking this stuff out and using it. But for the most part, I've been able to halt my use of it. In any system where I've pretty much seen a departure of the flying insects, I've halted the use of this stuff. Although I could certainly see the value in periodically bringing it back and, you know, just kind of keeping that stuff that's keeping the flying insects at bay, keep it in here, you know, keep it in the environment, even in a small degree, so it kind of acts as a preventative measure. So I guess the only thing here was to see if I can get some of these little clumps that are still down low and help them break apart a bit. Anything that feels bigger than, you know, anything even bigger than this, something that you could feel rolling around in your palm, seems like fair game. It's times like this I wish I had a second glove on so I could really help with that kind of crumbling action. But like I said, I'm coming in here on a semi-regular basis to do this a little bit, to till things around, move dry stuff on the surface down, and vice versa, bring some of the more damp stuff up to let it air out. And I think we're getting there, but this stuff I believe still needs a little bit more time to dry, oddly enough. It's been quite some time now since we removed the coverings that were preventing drying at all. But now it's, I think, the more humid air is preventing the evaporation of the moisture from the system. So drying is certainly not happening in here as quickly as it would have happened in the winter time when the furnace was running. But it's so clear to see. I mean, as the stuff continues to crumble and break apart, Some of the clumpiness is lost as time goes on. There's like really nice material hiding here. And I guess the bonus here is that I feel no need to add food to this system, not at all, because it does seem to me like every time I do a crumbling like this, what I'm leaving behind is a good bit of food for them to work on. I'm releasing a little bit of carbon-based bedding bits that seem to also get clumped up inside of these little balls here and there. And I think just as things dry off too, the balls or the clumps start to break down on their own too. So very nice stuff. I guess got too wet. Even though the worms probably really enjoy the excess moisture, it does certainly, I guess, number one, prevent the opportunity from the material getting screened. And not only that, if we were to try to initiate the migration of the worms out of the material, try to do a migration, I think the moisture present in the material would result in worms just having no interest in leaving and just staying put, rather than coming over to some sort of a collection area that you've set up. Very weird, you know, I got to admit, I thought this stuff would be drier by now, but it's taking quite some time. Luckily, I'm not in a rush or a hurry for this material. I've got a pretty decent collection of castings. So I treat all these as like opportunities to learn. Try to, I think the reaction time as seasons change, it's got to be more synchronized with the lessening of the furnace operating. As soon as that furnace stops working, or, well, I mean, I actually turn it off at one point so it doesn't come on when it's really not needed anymore. I believe it's at that point I should start assuming that all my bins are going to start hanging onto their moisture incredibly, because that wicked dry air coming out of the climate control system is no longer drying my systems, and then things go in the opposite direction. So looks like hardly anything has stuck to my glove. All right, well, we'll put these guys back over to the side, get the regular bin out here, and we'll get them fed. Now, this is at this point the oldest system that still has a plastic covering. I mean, the newest of my systems, the one that's like maybe only a couple weeks old over there, for that to still have a plastic cover, that makes complete sense when a system is still mostly bedding. This poor guy got stranded. Not good. Haven't seen that in a while, luckily, but once in a while that's going to happen, I believe. And I believe there does come a point in a bin's life when enough castings have developed that this system no longer needs the help of a plastic cover to prevent excess moisture from evaporating. In fact, I believe there is probably a point where you probably really need to start the evaporation of some of the moisture in the system so material can, you know, not get clumpy like we saw. So now this must have been a nice single sheet of newspaper which has been cut to ribbons by the worms nibbling at it. So I don't think we'll be using that as a top covering piece of paper either. Let's see if we can move this piece as a single object. We can. How do you like that? I think perhaps if I'd been more careful, maybe I could have done the same with that too, but this stuff is pretty worn. Perhaps we'll just use it as bedding in the feeding area versus trying to keep using it as a covering. I've got more newspaper over here next to me. We can always get it a nice new fresh covering if we wanted to. And at the same time, as long as we're talking about coverings, I'm wondering if there is perhaps an opportunity here to switch over to more of like a paper-based type covering versus continuing on with the plastic. Because if we could, I'd really like to. I think there's that added benefit of a little extra airflow in general from an oxygen perspective, but I guess, yeah, the airflow itself would also enable a little bit more manageable moisture happening here rather than letting stuff get too muddy and clumpy. But luckily here everything seems pretty loose. Even though I could feel a good bit of moisture, nothing's clumping up, and it might just be because it's still not such a densely saturated bin with so many castings in it that the castings are really, you know, as a result of getting too wet, kind of forming around scattered objects. The castings, I think, do need to kind of stay dry enough to be able to remain as independent little objects separate from the surrounding materials. they can't get muddy and start to stick and smear all over the surrounding stuff, and that, because that's when you really start to get weird stuff going on. I think there is that point where you got to be careful not to let it get past. And I think that's just what happened in the castings bin. And I've been pretty vigilant on the whole matter too, because I think that that can also kind of become the beginning of some really lousy conditions for the worms. It's just so funny how one huge massive worm, it's kind of like you're walking down the street and then all of a sudden, like, the tallest guy from the Guinness Book of World Records just like happens to be standing right there on the corner in front of you. Look at the size of that worm. It's kind of what I envisioned all the worms in the system being as far as their size, but you hear all these stories about, why worms that have the potential to grow that big don't grow that big. It's because they say, well, if those big worms are needing to cohabitate in their environment with a bunch of baby worms, then the presence of all the baby worms, I believe, for whatever reason, causes the big adult worms to stay a little bit smaller. So they say the trick is to keep the adults away from the babies, and that'll provide an environment where the African night crawlers actually have the ability to, grow to a greater size and fulfill their potential from that aspect, just from like bodily growth. I'm not sure if it shows up in the video, but once in a while I'll see a cocoon. Considering how African night crawlers are a good size, beefy worm, it's interesting how their cocoons seem to be pretty puny in size. This is kind of cool too. It's like I just looked down, and I don't know if you could see it. I believe you probably can. That there's just two cocoons right next to each other within the material. So I don't know, you can't resist kind of checking out a cocoon or two when you see them. And I'm happy to see that they're content enough in this material that they're making cocoons and planning to expand their numbers in here. I'm not going to keep pulling it up and showing it to the camera, but I do keep seeing cocoons all over the place, which is awesome. We gave that other side a pretty good tilling over and inspection. Maybe we'll do the same on this other side. We've not been doing anything unusual in here in terms of how we're feeding. A lot of my systems I've been doing sort of side to side, back and forth feedings, moving the feeding area from corner to corner, and those are really interesting little feeding patterns to adopt. But when I'm not doing anything out of the ordinary, then I always default back to my standard way of feeding, which is right down in the middle of the bin. All right. That last handful, it felt like I combed my finger through a whole bunch of wormies. Man, look at some of these sticks in here. I wonder what's going to become of these, if they'll ever break down or if they're just going to have to get removed. Sometimes big stuff comes in with the leaves that I use as bedding. Alright. Luckily I didn't find too much clumpy stuff, but when it comes up and I feel it in my hand, I like to try to break it apart and keep things loose. So there's definitely nothing, getting compacted or nasty or anything. Everything in this bin seems to be in the perfect proportions in terms of moisture and the bedding and the compost surrounding. Everything just seems to be in nice balance for there to be just a good flow, a good general dampness everywhere, a good abundance of bedding all over the place. Food, on the other hand, I'm not sure. I have not really gone directly at the feeding area, but number one, I think it was pretty fast composting foods that we gave them last time. And whether or not we're going to see a lot of leftovers remains to be seen here. Oh, is that a carrot? Yeah, look at that. It just seemed so bright and, bright orange in color. Because, they're just working it down gradually. Or maybe this out here, it looks like they went right past the nasty outer skin of it, and they went right into the nice soft stuff underneath. And that's what they're doing. And they'll get back to that tougher stuff later, but that was kind of interesting to see. Here's another mango seed, very worn. Put it over here with the other one. Well, I wonder what else we'll see. They definitely like carrots, that's for sure. This is some sort of food. Oh, this has got to be a jalapeno pepper. Woohoo! I had a few jalapeno peppers in my freezer. I've been doling them out gradually to my systems. For whatever reason, peppers are just a food that I very rarely include in the feeding of my worm bins. So it's almost like an experiment to see how they go. And I know I've seen it, dozens of times on other channels, people feeding their worms peppers, so I know it's not a problem. Worms are going to like it. And there's already good evidence that they're breaking this stuff down. There's something going on here. This is, this is a pretty nice population of African night crawlers that I got from Northeast Worms, like you saw on the sticker. And the African night crawlers sometimes don't really have that tendency to mob around stuff when they find yummy foods. It's almost like they come in single file or something and take a little piece and move on or whatever, but you don't see that mobbing behavior so much amongst these night crawlers as you do with like blue worms or red wigglers. But down here in this feeding area, it does certainly seem like we've aroused their appetite, because they don't seem to be paying attention to their typical style of behavior of not jumbling together in a single spot. They're just all hanging down here in the feeding area. Surprise, surprise. Oftentimes I actually don't find a lot of worms in the feeding area of my bins. Sometimes they're off on the sides, out on the edges or whatever. But it does seem like in this case, after 11 days, coming back to the feeding area was the optimal place to go to see a good worm turnout. This is more just clumped up paper, I believe. Stuff that I'd really rather just kind of see crumbled apart. Alright. Stuff looks awesome. I don't think we need to do any more crumbling. In time we'll get all of it, but we're not going to need to get all of it today. So let's make sure we don't leave any of this stuff out on the surface here. We've almost got like a nice, I don't even know if we need to bring in any or more bedding with what we've already included down here. Yeah, you know what, I think we'll give them some more anyway, because these types of worms, these night crawlers, do almost as if they favor their bedding as their food source over the kitchen scraps. So as much as they seem to be enjoying these kitchen scraps, it could very well just be the bedding that's stoked with juices that they're really coming for. So tough to say. Gonna have to take a break, go get them some food, and then we can pick up where we left off and get this system fed, and we'll be done. Be right back. Well, what I came up with them is something that I normally classify as being a little bit of a ho-hum, boring kind of a feeding. Coffee. Perhaps because it's just the same color as the material that's already in the bin, so it just doesn't add any flash. But it definitely adds nourishment. And in this case, it's also doing so in a way that doesn't add any moisture. So I think between the decision to do away with the plastic cover, although we haven't really made the decision yet, but I believe by doing away with the plastic coverings, going with something that'll allow for a little bit better airflow, and perhaps by including a fairly dry feeding today, perhaps we'll start to see the moisture in here become something a little bit closer to what we'd like to see. So now, rather than getting my nice finely shredded bedding, I'm just going to start bringing in some this and that. So like I found a piece of paper bag that I tailored to be a nice new top covering for us. So that'll be part of our feeding. So before we go too crazy adding too much bedding, let's add the food. And I guess to make the food a little bit more interesting, we can include my worm chow. So I got a feeling this type of worm, these night crawlers, they really like the carbon, so the abundance of all of this paper, which is all basically a carbon-based bedding material for the most part, is really something that these worms almost don't even treat as much of a bedding for long, because they just start nibbling away at it and it's gone. So it is almost like something that they treat as more of a food item than their bedding. But the bedding's important too, so we want to make sure we keep it coming at them. And while it's really convenient to just grab my container full of paper that I ran through my shredder, and then have a lot of nice tiny bits of paper. It's just as good to throw large stuff in too, you know. It doesn't all have to be minuscule in size. The worms will eventually take care of making it so in time. So it's almost like we're building a lasagna layer here, right? And since it is a fairly dry feeding, I see no harm in adding a little bit more moisture, perhaps just a little bit more stuff that'll help us combat the unwelcome guests that are buzzing around in here. Like I said, you know, it's probably one of the last places where I'm still seeing the flying insects coming and going. They've really kind of vanished out of all my systems, and it does seem like as I tackle what appears to be excess moisture in a system, soon after that follows a sharp reduction, if not completed elimination of the bugs. So I'm kind of convinced that it was me leading things to becoming a little bit too damp, which just resulted in the flying insects coming on in here afterwards to take advantage of a hospitable place to lay their eggs and to foster the next generation. So I'm just going to do my best to reverse things, get stuff on track again here, so it's no longer, you know, kind of place that's going to be so bug friendly as it had been in the past. So kind of a weird, interesting layered feeding. And you know, I think by doing it this way, you're definitely going to attract a lot more attention to this bedding material, you know, by commingling it with different types of food items between the coffee in there as well as the worm chow. And the worm chow is just a mixture of ground up beans, ground up nuts, ground up seeds, ground up, you know, I don't even know, grains, you name it. So I don't think there's anything else that we collected over here that needs to go back down into the feeding area. I think we could just kind of level things off and get everything back to the point where we can get our new covering in here. Like I said, it's going to be paper. It's a paper bag that I cut to size, and it's not even such a, oops, I forgot about this cool carrot that they were working on over here. Let's make sure that's down here in the middle. Let them finish that delectable morsel, as well as that pepper. Alright, I forgot that I had put some leftovers over onto that side too. But with the covering, I think we'll maybe see a little bit more drying of the material, although it does seem to me like these coverings don't allow too much moisture to escape. I'm sure a little bit does make its way through, but at the same time, even though it's paper, it does seem to, you know, do a pretty decent job keeping the moisture in. So while plastic is good for, you know, extreme moisture retention, paper also seems to do a good enough job that, you know, in most cases you can maintain pretty good balance with paper only and not worry about things getting too dry or too damp. So that's it for our African night crawlers, everyone. A little bit more time in the cocoon nursery before we try rounding the worms up in there. And here, this was feeding number, how much was it? 6 times before. This is feeding number 7 of our 91-day-old African nightcrawler system. So I'm going to take care of getting things put away and cleaned up, but I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. And if there's also, perhaps, if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, there's the join button, and there's the memberships over there too. So, all right, everyone, thanks again for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.